Okay, so good day, people. Hope everyone is well. I'm going to follow up a little bit on the discussion that I've been having with Matt on my channel about panpsychism and I guess the origins of consciousness. What's the best way to account for the consciousness that we experience right here, right now, and then how is that related to all the different forms of sentience that we find, I guess, throughout nature? And to what extent is something similar to or resembling any of that in the inorganic realm that predated life that we know on this planet, something like that. Okay, I think part of it, Matt, when you were speaking, I mean, so much of this is an issue of language, and I'm going to probably keep returning to this problem of language throughout this video, but it's that I don't think that it's the right word choice is that it was just mechanical. I don't think the claim is that there is a kind of machine working like a clock that eventually it became, it gave birth to life out of mere mechanism. See, I think that narrative already creates lots of problems. So I think part of the problem is we need to begin with the limits of human thought. That is, we can think things to their extreme and show that thought doesn't really seem to make much sense when we get to the ultimates. So if I say, it seems like either, and someone could make the argument, say, well, it seems like either life always was or it came out of nothing. And neither of those make any sense. To say that somehow it always was, well, the always just doesn't really work. I mean, there's a limitation of human thought there. Or if you say, well, there was nothing and then there was something, that doesn't seem to work either. Now, what's interesting is that even though thought fails there, I mean, thought doesn't really robustly seem to be able to comprehend either of those options as satisfactory. Either one of them could be true, and they could be counterintuitively true in very strange ways. So let me give the example. It would be something like this, that there was a kind of nothingness. Now, again, it's hard to talk about whatever this kind of nothingness. It wasn't an ordinary absence as we experience here, that is a no thing. It was a pure potentiality of abs. It was so absent of everything that it was pure potentiality. It was a kind of nothingness. And that nothingness gave way to the inorganic realm. Now, the inorganic realm, as it blew out of the nothingness, it is not mechanical. At no point would I just use it as it wasn't like a machine was created out of nothing. No, out of this nothingness poured a highly dynamic energy field with amazing interactive capacities due to the symmetry, the balance, the forms of orderliness that were built into this energy field created forms of sustained interaction over great periods. Now, this question of randomness. Okay, so Matt, you were talking about the helium atom, and the helium atom sort of having something similar to at least a family resemblance to what somebody's going to call agency. They're going to say, well, it has a desire or a yearning, or it's trying to achieve something like more beauty, more life. That is, it's the inorganic is moving toward life, I guess, kind of in the narrative, as I understood it, as the narrative you're giving. I wouldn't myself. I'm not as sympathetic to that argument. I would be more interested in, because there, in order to make that claim, then you'd have to be able to make the claim that at that level, at the inorganic level, the early congealing of the cosmos, what the probability would have been in order to start to say there was low enough level randomness to have adaptive behavior. It is, I don't think that we have any of those kinds of statistics. Well, my video is not coming through here, but it's flickering. I don't know how to get this light changed. At any rate, I think randomness, the degree of randomness, is somewhat impossible to determine at that level, but someone could at least then say, well, the the embedded levels of randomness were those conditions that were necessary for life to be a natural precipitate out of the orderliness. Again, the kinds of randomness that were there and embedded in the orderliness, it somehow naturally precipitated out life. Now, how ubiquitous is life? Maybe amidst the vast cosmos, life only occurred on Earth. I mean, but at least we have evidence that it does, that it has naturally precipitated out. Now, I would want to give the claim that it wasn't a yearning, it wasn't a striving on the behalf of the subatomic particles. It wasn't a yearning at the atomic level. It was the balance, symmetry, harmony, and the overall forms of orderliness. Given enough time, they created the conditions that emerged, right? And then, okay, so before I go on to that, I think what's important here is to get at this issue of necessary but not sufficient conditions. So there's this, and this is how you're not placing it all the way back, but it is a kind of an emergentist position. That is, this pure potentiality, this kind of nothingness, a strange kind of nothingness, when it gave way to the inorganic realm that predated life by billions of years, when that occurred, it didn't leave the nothingness behind. No, the nothingness still got dragged along with it as its previous necessary but not sufficient condition for the organic. Then, for the inorganic. Then, as the inorganic realm gave way to life and produced biomolecules and subsequently generated bacteria and all the single cell, and then you had the eukaryote invasion and multicellularity and all this kind of stuff that happened on the planet, that didn't leave the inorganic behind. So at each case, the organic, it grows out of the inorganic, and the inorganic grows out of a kind of nothingness, and it, even though it emerges out of those, it's still distinct enough from them to have its own set of properties, its own set of dynamic relations that come into play that can't be observed at those earlier levels. So just, things like gravity and magnetic poles and certain elliptical sorts of relations, geometry doesn't really exist at the level of the nothing, but it does occur as the inorganic generates itself, somehow emerges out of that. And then as you get, life emerging out of the inorganic, it has so many different properties, including these things like we identify that are uniquely part of the organic and not part of the inorganic. So things like metabolism, things like nutrient gradients proper, things like goals, and those get more sophisticated as we look at the biodiversity, and as you get to very complex nervous systems that, as somebody posted a comment on my video, I think it was Mr. Roboto too, but he was talking about the difference between inputs to the nervous system and the nervous system's capacity for output, and the disparity there. And yeah, that's a huge issue, that we receive neurophysiologically so much, and yet the brain can only handle that by way of output, by these measly little abstractions that we use. And so much of it is, there's a failure of language, language's ability to, I guess, deal with all the complexity that's going on there. I think we slip all over the place. And as we're talking about it, it's ambiguous. And I don't mean it's indeterminate, like we can't decide. It's that the meanings of the words are overpopulated and they slide around without people really paying attention to the different meanings coming into play. But think of, one way to get at this is to suggest that, and this is why I was saying it was a wash. When I say it doesn't really matter, I don't need a panpsychist position as long as I have a robust emergentist position, is because I can say that the kind of consciousness that I experience is a direct manifestation of a natural occurrence in the world. I can come to see it as something that couldn't have not been. Now, I can, in my imagination, postulate the case that it could have not been, but that's just me denying the reality of the case. The reality of the case is that here we are. Here we all are. Each of us is a symptom, a kind of natural precipitate out of an orderliness that conceivably came out of nothing. Now, it doesn't mean that it's a fluke. No. Somehow the nothingness was required to precipitate out the orderliness, and then the orderliness was required to precipitate out all these diverse forms of life. Whether life itself is a blessing or a curse, I think people can haggle. People could have the discussion. But it does seem to be, and I'm sympathetic to your argument there, it does seem to be for life registers a yearning for increased orders of complexity and multiple levels, sort of emerging levels of dynamics not to be found at the earlier levels. So I want to see if I can get at that a little bit more. And I think part of the problem embedded in all of this discussion is the question of causality. So again, causality is a noise comes out of people's mouth. Causality, they make it seem like there's just this one thing there called causality, and they go, no, I mean material causality. Well, that's just as abstract. I mean, material causality. Okay, so let's see if we can get at some of the different kinds of material causality to show that yes, everything that occurs through material causal processes, but look at the wide range and varieties of what we mean by materials and what we mean by causality. Okay, so I think one would be to look at just standard Newtonian laws regarding mid-sized objects and even vast objects, planets, things like this. I think there we can talk about causality pretty clearly in terms of things like mass and gravitational force, and it's pretty specifiable on what we mean. Now, even there, it does get a little odd when we try to say, why is there gravity? Why is there why are there magnetic poles? Now, people can give a scientific explanation for the properties that are describable. They can say, well, here's what it is that makes this do what it does. But the sort of larger question of why was the universe characterized by those properties? Well, yeah, again, I think it does lend some support to the claim that for the sake of increasing complexity, life required those kinds of balances and harmonies and dynamics in order for it to emerge. And see, and this would be another way to say it, is that, and this is part of that delimitation of causality, my body and my experience of sentience, well, it's the entire cosmos is right now thinking through me, through each of us, through each sentient organism. It's using all of those prior and previous dynamics, and they haven't been left behind. So, do I need the gravitational field and the magnetic fields any less than I need the air around me or, food? Do I need the sun somehow less than I need my heart because my heart's really me and that's the biological process of me? Or I think people seem to imagine that consciousness is something going inside the brain or inside the person, and we can try to localize it that way, but the overall conditions which are necessary for it to occur include the entire cosmos. That's why, again, it's just like a wash for me. Okay, let's go back. So you have Newton's laws over mid-sized objects and planetary movements and this kind of stuff. Okay, so there we can give the laws and we can sort of talk about, why Copernicus, Galileo, why people were able to make predictions that they were because of the regularity of the bodies moving and whatnot. They're pretty describable. Okay, then you get to things that are still physical. Again, things like chemical causality, which aren't being directly caused in the same way by gravitational forces, by mass. Now, those are still part of it, but if you move to things like chemical reactions, something like the creation of polymers at various levels, or just the dissolve of sugar in water, if I dissolve sugar in water, there is a chemical binding or unbinding that's occurring, and it's happening not through those exact same processes, but it's still causal. Okay, now you go to just something even simpler, phase changes. So water, and water is such an interesting molecule, right? Because it's one of the very few liquids that expands when it goes to a solid state, because the molecules, they adjoin at right angles to one another. And so again, you see the difference between steam and water and ice, and here the properties that are there in the water, the dynamic structure that it has, it's being caused by things like temperature. And then we get at, how is that different than gravitational force? Well, they're all part of it. Now, those are, again, to me, still, they're pretty simple because we can calculate them, and we can make them subject to, I guess, various statistical arrays, and they're pretty well, solved in terms of modern science. But when you move to some of these more difficult issues of how do sensory capacities, memory systems, nervous systems, and then symbolic processes, language processes, how do these relate to causality? If I look both ways when I'm going to cross the street, and I decide to cross because I don't see anyone coming, is my viewing causing me to cross? How exactly does visual perception hook into the causality? Now, I'm not saying that it's not materially causal. I'm saying that causality is ambiguous, and it has a lot more of what loose and temporal connections, forms of relation, than just simply gravitational fields and or chemical bonds. Now, somebody might try to reduce it down to what's just going on in the brain, but the problem with that is that there is the larger environment that my brain is always registering, and my brain is adapting. It's a squid swimming inside the skull, and it's become what it has by ways of registering the environment and dealing with it, I guess, as it can. I'm not going to reshoot this, but the lighting is really bad here. I'm sorry about that, people. I don't know what I'm going to do. Again, what's causing this? I don't know if you can hear it. It's the thunderstorm going on right now. So I'm going to give the last example I have here, Matt, and this will be, again, it's a little bit far maybe from where I began, but I think it is related. These problems of what we mean by consciousness, they are related to what we mean by causality, and then this is all embedded in these problems of what is language, and how are the ambiguities of language partly creating these obstacles for us as we're thinking about these issues. But think of the difference here between a push and a name call. Now, the kids are on the playground and they're pushing one kid, they push the kid down, and they bring physical harm to the child through a hard push. That's sort of describable within, I think, what we're going to call, the physical mass and force, acceleration. You're going to have, gravity, certain, there's going to be properties that are going to be pretty analyzable there. Now, the name calling is a different thing. It seems very different. Now, I think in some way, name calling, it can cause harm. Now, what kind of harm can be caused from some person making noises? If you don't speak the language, it can't harm you. So it's somehow, it's different than the transactive, one person's force upon another. In some way, me speaking the language makes me complicit in bringing the harm that I'm able to do to myself in understanding what they say. But even there, somebody says to me, you're an idiot. And I hear them and I say, oh, you meant you are an idiot, not you're an idiot. Geez, I think you don't know language. I think you don't know English. There you start to see that when someone says something to you, it's not a force exerted over against you, because the way that you react to it partly defines what it was. And so the definition of the situation, oftentimes, that's, it's sort of crucial to what we're going to call the overall outcome of some situation, of how people were affected, what the impact was, and yet how, naming and defining as part of the causal world, I think it's not yet really been robustly figured out. I think many people are still, they're sort of saying, is it directly causal? No. Well, what kind of causality is it? I think it's a material causality, but people are going to need to deal with much more sophisticated problems. They're going to have more sophisticated language to tackle issues like what is consciousness? How does it relate to sentience? How does it relate to language? And what exactly is the relation of all of those to this thing we call material causality? I don't think anything has to get outside of material causality, but I think we're going to have to make room for all those necessary but not sufficient conditions which are buried in the backdrop.